current events, Bible prophecy, the ancient past. How does it all fit together? Find out now. This is Pictures of the End.
Hello, thank you for joining me today. You are listening to Pictures of the End. My name is Tim Rumsey. We're going to be talking today about fear and the Bible's call for us to not be afraid. Throughout the Bible, God has spoken to many people, and one of the most common things that God says to people, especially when he first starts that conversation, is do not be afraid. We're going to be talking about this today, especially in light of all that's going on in our world. How can we live without fear? What are some biblical principles and keys for living with peace and assurance, even as the world seems to be falling apart around us? Now, our guest today is my friend Jeff Marshall. Jeff has a background in pastoral ministry, education, and the healthcare industry. And given his experience in both ministry and healthcare, I thought it would be interesting to get his take on how people are handling the stresses associated with this pandemic, and also to explore the Bible's keys for dealing with fear and stress and anxiety. So, Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim.
Absolutely. We'll just dive right into our conversation and study. There is a prophecy that Jesus gives in the book of Luke, chapter 21, and I'd like to read just a few lines from that. This is Luke 21, verse 25. Jesus says, "There shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth." Just a fascinating prophecy about men's hearts failing them for fear. Jeff, do you believe that we are seeing at least a partial fulfillment of this prophecy during this global pandemic?
Yeah, I don't think anyone can deny that obviously there's external signs going on that, that God's coming back soon, but what you're hitting on is absolutely true. People are seeing in their own hearts the fear rising up, and it's making people search, but it's also it's also at the level that it's happening at. We're used to experiencing fear, we're used to experiencing anxiety, but we're not so accustomed to our entire community experiencing fear and then handling it differently. So the idea that my neighbor is also scared, as well as my local and state and national and even world leaders are expressing and experiencing this fear. I think everyone's noticing that. And I definitely think it's a sign of a fulfillment of prophecy, as you said.
Now, we're both Christians. We both believe that these are signs of Christ's soon return. It's interesting, though, when you look at society in a cross-section, even those that aren't Christians that don't, believe Christ might be coming back soon, there's still this sense, isn't there, that our world is going through something that will change it forever, and we're not going back to whatever that normal was beforehand.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that this probably is ripping out the rug of security for many people. Yeah. And as you were saying, when you see those around you and even those in leadership positions that are supposed to have the answers, when they seem fearful as well, then, what do you have left to stand on?
Right.
What kinds of things, you're looking at this from your background in ministry, also your involvement with healthcare. What kinds of things do you believe people have been fearing in relation to the pandemic?
Well, that's a big question. There's a lot of things people are fearing in relation to the pandemic, but the immediate thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is each other. Like our fear of each other has grown. So we have fears like maybe legitimate fears about how far we should stay away from each other, whether I should stay isolated or whether I should stay 6 feet away or wear a mask. You have all of those fears, but then those are spilling over into whether you're liberal or conservative politically, and and it's increasing the emotion in conversations, and it's decreasing our capacity to communicate and to listen and to understand. So yeah, I think that's there's just a very strong, what's the word for it? A very, very strong trajectory that society's having, not just individuals.
We also have this virus floating around our world that you can't see. You can't, we know it's there. We see the effects of it, but we can't see it with our eyes and so forth. Don't you think that this kind of unseen enemy also takes a toll emotionally and psychologically on all of us?
Yeah, for sure. And the uniqueness, I think, we've had diseases. We've grown up with diseases. There have been pandemics before. I haven't lived through a pandemic, so I can't comment on that. And historians have all kinds of opinions. But one thing that's very unique, I think, to this one is people are confused as to what they should fear, right? Should I really be afraid of COVID, or should I be afraid of the vaccine, right? Or should I be afraid of this politician, or should I be afraid of that politician? And so part of the challenge of the fear that society is experiencing right now is we're not quite sure what we should truly be afraid of. But then there are people who are extremely sure that you should be afraid of the thing I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of the vaccine, so you should be afraid of this, like this, or I'm afraid of COVID, so you should be afraid. And then that ups the animosity and all the kind of loaded statements and the high emotion between people. So I think you got a really unique mix in all of Earth's history going on with fear. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like yes, there's an invisible thing happening that's scary, but out of that invisible thing that's happening, it's very confusing because it's invisible. Which thing am I supposed to be afraid of that people are telling me to be afraid of? Because I've got family and friends that are very divided on these issues, right? And it'd be a lot easier if I was very sure of, X is the thing to be afraid of. And everyone else was very sure, yeah, you're right, X is the thing to be afraid of. But in our world today, people are afraid of X, Y, and Z. And so, we don't have an agreement. We don't have an agreement on what we're supposed to be afraid of.
Right. And knowing whether X, Y, or Z is the most dangerous of the three just adds to the stress. Right. And it
tears down relationships, which relationships are an antidote to fear. I mean, they're an antidote to fear. Just what you said a few minutes ago, when an angel shows up, or when God shows up in the Bible, one of the first things they say is, don't be afraid. The follow through on that is because I'm here for communication. I'm here for interaction, right? But in today's world, it's like, be afraid. And if you're not afraid like me, then we can't be friends.
Yeah. I've heard a number of people say that the two things people have feared the most with this pandemic are hospitalization and then, of course, death. We can understand the death part probably, but the hospitalization aspect is something new, again, at least in my experience, and that's because for most of these months when someone goes into the hospital with COVID, they are going to be alone and isolated.
Right.
And isn't that probably a huge part of the fear connected with all of this? I might die alone, or I might suffer alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And psychology has been, over the last few years, figuring out that an enormous number of our, for instance, addiction, they're connecting addiction with being disconnected. So if you're a person that's not connected, you don't have a social connection within a group, then you're far more likely to suffer from addiction. So it only follows through that some people, I know of more than one story where they're kind of making the choice, like, yeah, I might die if I stay home, but I'd rather die with control, or I'd rather die with people that care about me around than die alone. Some people are far more afraid of being alone than actually dying.
Mm-hmm. You're bringing to mind a passage in Genesis chapter 2. This is one of those places that describes the creation of the world according to the biblical viewpoint. And in Genesis 2:18, after God has created Adam, God says, "It is not good that the man should be alone." Right. If we take the Bible's narrative here, God knew right from the beginning that isolation for a human being is not a good thing.
Right.
And now we see on a societal-wide level people being isolated like we probably have never been before.
Right. And we're being isolated physically, but we're also being isolated intellectually and spiritually, right? So with the facts that people aren't totally sure what to be afraid of, that's bringing more than physical isolation. It's bringing what's the word for it? Intellectual and spiritual isolation, because people are arguing at church, and we don't know how to accept that some people are scared of different things within this pandemic.
Yeah. Well, and, I think the collateral damage from this kind of mental stress, emotional stress, don't you think we haven't even started to see what that collateral damage is? Aren't these things that could roll out for years into the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Just like, yeah, for sure. And I just saw a lecture by Dr. Neil Nedley, in which, I don't want to get in the details of it because I can't remember everything, but he was talking about the comorbidities with COVID. And obviously we all know the number one comorbidity with COVID is obesity, but I believe he was saying either number 2 or number 3, and the comorbidity that can bring about fatality or bring about death is actually anxiety.
Wow.
And so having anxiety, as you're, kind of the theme for our conversation is fear, or, anxiety is just another side of that same coin. That's exacerbating the issue.
I guess in one sense, this shouldn't surprise us because, we know now that stress can cause all kinds of physiological disease and so forth in our body. Our brains, our minds, and our body are very connected, aren't they?
Right, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, I used to work on a heart floor. That's what I did in nursing. And so, I mean, we didn't have cases of people being anxious being on our floor, but I understand the physiology somewhat. And, when you have an acute situation, so you and I are in a parking lot and a bomb goes off, right? Or loud noise, we don't even know if it's a bomb. Our heart rate's going to go up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's good, because we're getting more nutrition to all of our body because more blood's being pumped, and we can react and respond to that in a way that's going to make a difference, right? And that's a very positive thing. But when you have your heart rate, when you live anxiously and it's more of a chronic situation, your heart literally does sort of slowly fail, because when your heart rate goes up and stays chronically up, then the power declines over time, and you literally have heart issues because of high chronic stress or chronic anxiety, or we could say chronic fear. So when the Bible says this, it's actually, even though it's got kind of a psychological or a spiritual dimension to it, it's actually got a physiological dimension to it as well, bordering
on a medical explanation of what will be happening. Right. Wow, that's fascinating. Well, we're coming up to a break here. When we come back from that break, we're going to kind of steer our conversation into the Bible's keys for living without fear in our world today. The Bible has a lot to say about how to live without fear. And I think now more than ever, we need these kinds of promises. So please don't go away. We'll be right back after this break.
Over 3,000 years ago, God gave His people a blueprint revealing the mysteries of salvation. Today, the Sanctuary's message retains its potency and power. The Shadow of His Wings is a 10-part study guide set that explores the incredible Bible truths revealed by the Ark of the Covenant and the Most Holy Place. Each lesson reveals a clearer picture of God's incredible promise to forgive sin and make His righteousness available to you. Topics include the hidden relationship between the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane, the nature of sin, the new birth experience, how Jesus lived by faith, the mystery of God, and the connection between the Most Holy Place and the second coming of Jesus Christ. For a limited time while supplies last, get your own free study guide set of The Shadow of His Wings. Visit us online at picturesoftheend.com or call us toll-free at 855-HIS-TRUTH. That's 855-447-8788.
Welcome back. You are listening to Pictures of the End. I'm speaking with Jeff Marshall today. He's been a pastor, an educator. He works in the healthcare industry. And we're talking about fear, our response to it, especially in light of this global pandemic. And as we go through the second half of our discussion today, Jeff, is it possible to live without fear, given all these things that are going on? Is it actually possible to live without the fear that so many of us have probably felt on many days?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely possible. I would also say I would say yes and no. I think fear is a very real human emotion, and I think a lot of us as Christians try to act like we're good Christians by acting like we're not afraid. But the problem with that is the act, right? So to get to a genuine place of not living in fear, I think that's totally possible. However, you kind of have to embrace the beast in order to wrestle with it. But if you wrestle with it, you can win.
Okay, so let's look at what are some biblical principles that can help us wrestle with this thing in a productive and from a Christian standpoint, a victorious way.
Yeah. So I would say to someone that's like, well, I'm trying to stop being afraid. Probably if someone came to me with that question, I would say, well, the first thing is, are you afraid of the right thing? Right? Because, fearing God actually is a very biblical concept. And we try to take that, and what I've seen people do is, it's not fear like being scared. It's fear like awe and respect. And it certainly is fear like awe and respect, but it's also fear like kind of being afraid. Like, God's really powerful and really strong. And so when you talk about quote unquote wrestling with the monster, right? Like whether it's COVID or you just struggle with anxiety because of something from a child or whatever. Just like Jacob, I think we need to wrestle with God, and then all the other fears are going to be put in their places. Jacob spent a night wrestling with God, and he woke up the next day to face his brother. And the textual evidence is that he was still quite concerned that his brother might wipe him and his entourage out, right? Mm-hmm. But he approached it in a different way than if he had not spent that night in wrestling with God. And that night wrestling with God, was there fear? There certainly was, but he wrestled with God. And so the first thing I would say is make sure you wrestle with God first. Before you wrestle with COVID or your next door neighbor or childhood trauma or whatever it is, God's really the place to wrestle with. And when you get oriented there, all the other fears are going to fall into their place.
Now, what do you mean by wrestle with God?
That's a big question for the person with childhood trauma. Let's go that route for a second. Well, wrestling with God could be, God could have prevented that, but didn't. Why didn't he? Those are very legitimate questions to kind of get into and talk to God about and struggle with. And there's some very great answers. I'm sure we don't have time with today. Or say you're struggling with COVID, right? And you're scared of COVID because you're scared you're going to die. So instead of focusing on struggling with COVID, maybe wrestle with God and the idea of death. Like, why I'm scared of dying, God, and what do I do with this? And how do I, so take the struggle, I would say, to God instead of to something that's not God.
So you're really talking about a communication with God. We're talking about prayer, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely prayer. Prayer is the antidote to anxiety, for sure. And God's promises, the truth of his word.
Okay. If we're looking at Jacob's story there, he did pray, but there was some action that followed that as well, wasn't there?
Right. He held on and he begged for a blessing. He demanded a blessing, not in an arrogant way, but in a this is the only way for me to be blessed way. He was quite persistent.
Yeah. In what ways can a Christian worldview of ultimate reality, so life, death, what happens when we die, who's ultimately in control, how can this kind of mindset or worldview help us in this fight against our fears?
Yeah, so if we believe there's a God, and you and I do very much, let's go back to our parking lot scenario. You and I are sitting in the car in the parking lot, and there's an explosion or a loud noise, right? And then there's also a person running by with a gun, right? And then across the other way, we see, I'm just coming up with weird stuff. A group of rabid dogs, right? Now we're gonna have to make a decision on which thing to be scared of, because you can't respond to all of those things at once. Like, what's the priority? And I think, like, God is always the priority, and you see people in the Bible that struggle with God through prayer and through His promises, and they work through those struggles. Then these other things like disease and enemies and loneliness, those things get put into a perspective where, are they still there? Yes, they're still there. But do they have the same power? No, they do not. So what's going to happen when you orient onto God and the fear of God is that these other things are still going to be present, but they're not going to have the same power that they once had.
Let's swing that question now towards death. What does the Bible tell us that can help us? We may never want to die, but what does the Bible tell us that can help us from being fearful of death in an ultimate sense?
There's hope. that there's. I mean, you went with Genesis earlier. We could go to there. We could go there when, God told them when they ate the fruit, the day that they ate of it, they would surely die. But they didn't die that day because He stepped in. And though it was the inevitable result, the ultimate result is also redemption, right? So just that very first story, we see death is going to come. It's an absolute for this scenario, but it's not the ultimate, right?
Yeah. And of course, the Bible gives us many promises about the resurrection at the second coming. I remember when my father-in-law was sick with COVID and then eventually died with it. Many times he expressed his faith and his trust in God. Of course, he hoped that he would recover, but he said, if I don't, I'm still going to trust God. I know that I will. This death here on this earth isn't the final chapter of my life. There's that hope of a life beyond. And certainly this is something that can help free us from those claws of fear, isn't it?
For sure. What you were just saying about your father-in-law strikes a memory with me. My first couple of years in ministry as a chaplain at an academy, and we had 3 students die in a car accident. This happened on a Friday, and the whole community, a lot of churches in the area, this was in AUC up in Massachusetts, we all come together for a church service, and guess who's speaking? You don't have the 20 hours you need to prepare a decent sermon. You got so many things going on. I mean, I literally had minutes, and God just really blessed. But the main point that God brought to my mind and that I gave to this whole community in that situation was, death is not final. Death is not final. And I think when you understand that death is not final, COVID, it changes your perspective on COVID. When you understand your friends, right? Friends treating you bad, or the conflict that's come up, whether, Republican, Democrat, all these different things, right? Whatever that conflict is, it's not final. Just as death is not final, these other things we fear, they're not final. But there is one thing that is final, and that is God, right? The Alpha and the Omega. And so fearing God being the beginning of wisdom, it truly is. Because when we orient there, like your father-in-law, his death, that doesn't have to be final, right? Mm-hmm. My friends not liking me, or whatever, that tough situation there, or my anxiety from my childhood issues, or whatever people have, none of those things have to be final. So the real thing we should be afraid of is not being in a right relationship with God. That actually truly is scary, because that's what will bring finality to our life. But COVID, whatever issues create our anxiety, society's anger and all this, none of those things are final, but God is.
I've got time probably for one more question here. You mentioned toward the beginning of our conversation that there is a fear of God. You know, the Bible calls us repeatedly to fear God. An example would be Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. This is the last thing that King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, really his conclusion of what life means. And he says in this verse, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." We are called to fear in a certain sense. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit, Jeff? You know, what is this kind of fear that we should be striving for?
Yeah, so I figured you would ask that question. So I studied it. And when you look, I mean, anyone can do this. Get a Strong's Concordance, look up the word fear, look at the definition of the word, look at the verses where it's used, right? And that's what I did. And I've done this before. And every time I try to find it out, what you hear people say is, well, when you fear God, it doesn't really mean fear. I'm not sure that's true. Like, our God is powerful, like really powerful. Our God is strong, like really strong. I think when you fear God, you actually should be afraid of him. And hear me out on that. That's where it starts. But then because when you fear something, you're totally oriented on it. And I think that's what God's saying is like, I'm the final thing. I'm the big thing. If you're going to fear me, and then God takes you to a place of intimacy where that fear turns into respect and awe. But we always understand the power and the majesty of God. Just a little short anecdotal story. Like, as a child, I feared my father. I was legitimately afraid of upsetting him sometimes, not because he abused me, not because he was mean. I don't have those stories, but because I was afraid of discipline. My dad was the ultimate authority in life, right? But as a child. But as time went on and we spent time together, we had intimacy and friendship and fellowship. To this day, as an adult, I'm bigger than my dad. I'm none of that should be a thing, right? But I still have this deep awe that has fueled and propagated a very close relationship. And so what I would say is, don't try to psychologically deconstruct, a fear of God. There's legitimate reasons to be afraid of him, but just like a good father, he's going to take that fear and he's going to use it to build intimacy and a very deep relationship that is going to give you the security that you're actually after.
Okay. Well, Jeff, thank you. We are out of time. You've been listening to Pictures of the End. We hope that you'll join us again next time.
You have been listening to Pictures of the End, a production of Pathway to Paradise Ministries. Pictures of the End is available via your favorite podcast service and also at www.picturesoftheend.com.